IGPP Expert Talks. I am Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. As New Delhi gears up to host the G20 summit and showcase its economical, cultural and technological prowess to the world, we dive into India's foreign policy priorities with Dr. Happymon Jacob. Dr. Happymon Jacob is a New Delhi-based academic, columnist and commentator, an associate professor of disarmament studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has authored 7 books. Dr. Happymon Jacob is also the founder of CSDR, Council for Strategic and Defense Research. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you, Heena.
So, in the simplest terms, what does India's foreign policy look like today, and how has it evolved in the past 10 years from under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to the current regime under Prime Minister Narendra Modi?
Thank you, Heena, for that question. I think it's interesting that we take stock of India's foreign policy at this point of time, and I'm happy that you used the word evolved over time. And clearly, it has evolved. India is not the India of 1947. India is not the India of 1991 either. India of 2023 is a major international player, a power to reckon with. Its gross power has increased over time. In 1991, India was almost about to default, in a big way, and we had to open up the economy. India has come a long way. Today, it is a $3.8 trillion economy, the 5th largest economy in the world, one of the biggest military powers in the world with nuclear weapons. It's the most populous country on planet Earth. The fact that the power has grown over time has also influenced the opinion of others about India. Today, the international community looks at India as a major player. It looks at India as a power that can, in fact, even perhaps bring peace between the two warring countries, Russia and Ukraine. So they have been, in fact, asking India to do its own bit there. So I think there is, on the one hand, a growth in power, on the other hand, an acceptance of India as a major power by the international community. And third, there is also a certain amount of, I think, sense of direction in India's foreign policy today to pursue certain objectives that are going to be of great importance to India over the long term. However, there are also problems with India's foreign policy. For example, India continues to be a balancing power. It's not able to or willing to put in place cohesive strategies that will make India a part of the international governance system in some ways. But more importantly, I think the rise of China has clearly come as a major challenge to India for the first time in India's history. Pre-independence and post-independence put together, if you have a superpower rising in your neighborhood with aggressive intentions. And I'll stop with 2 more challenges as it were. I think the other major challenge that India faces is that we don't have a cohesive national security doctrine, or do we have people, enough diplomats to sort of amplify India's voice on the global stage or articulate its interests internationally. The second big challenge, apart from the issue of a strategy and personnel to carry forward India's foreign policy, the second major challenge really is that of the domestic economic growth. Any country historically has only become a great power by ensuring that there is consistent and continuous domestic economic growth, and that is where I think we are falling short. We have millions of people who are living under the poverty line. So it is one thing to say that we are a major military power and our GDP is XYZ, which is all very impressive, but at the same time per capita GDP is not that impressive, clearly not. And the fact that there are issues, festering issues within the country, will continue to slow India's growth in some ways going forward. But India has come a very long way. I want to sort of emphasize and highlight that point.
So what are these objectives that you talk of India's foreign policy affair, or so as to say, what are the priorities upon which India's foreign policy is based today?
I think there have been fundamental changes in the manner India is looking at the external world in many ways. Just to give you a couple of, a couple of fundamental changes in India's foreign policy in the last 10 years to 15 years. One is the move from Pakistan to China. For a very long time, and I've been a scholar studying Pakistan for a long time. For a very long time, India was obsessed with the subcontinental, let's say, dogfight with the Pakistani state. Today, India has made a decision to move from Pakistan to China in a decisive manner. And I think that's a major change because India realizes what is the bigger challenge here, and that is China. Secondly, for a very long time after independence, India sort of ignored its maritime strategy, maritime space. Today, in the shape of the Indo-Pacific, there is a new opportunity out there where the entire world is focusing their energies on. So, New Delhi has been, in my personal opinion, therefore moving its strategic attention from the continental space to the maritime space, which is Indo-Pacific. And thirdly, I think there is also a new geo-economic, spurt in the Indian sort of consciousness in some ways. When Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, he ended all FTA negotiations, free trade agreement negotiations. Today, you have a situation where India is restarting many of these negotiations and signing on to many of these negotiations. With the big one with the EU is ongoing. And finally, I would stop by saying that there is also a realization in Delhi that you need to move on from Russia to a lot more partners. You can't have just one partner or two partners. You need to have multiply and sort of have several partners in the international system in order to secure interest. But that also comes with the challenges, because if you are in too many boats, who is going to stand by you at a time of need? So it's not without challenges, but I think India has made some conscious efforts in clearly identifying, if not clearly articulating, its interest for the 21st century.
You talk of the rising power of China and India's foreign policy strategic shift from Pakistan to China. We recently had the BRICS summit, which concluded recently in South Africa, and we saw that 6 new members were inducted in the grouping. Many commentators have said that it essentially means a victory for China. And so is India losing its influence, at least in this particular grouping of BRICS? And does the expansion really means that BRICS is now the flag bearer of developing economies, or how important is BRICS?
I think there are several ways of looking at the recent BRICS summit and whether China has come on top at the end of the day. I think to begin with, it is important to understand that BRICS is not one of those key organizations in the international system that can shape the international politics in any significant way. It is more symbolic rather than substantive. Of course, there is there are several important countries as part of that, but unlike, say, the UNSC or say the G7 or even G20 for that matter, are probably more powerful than BRICS in that sense. That's point number one. Secondly, I think by expanding BRICS, it may have become a little less relevant. If you expand it beyond the current 5 to 11, which is what it is now, you're looking at more voices, more competition, more disagreements. The effectiveness becomes much less. And also remember, these are not countries that are aligned to a particular cause. These are not countries that really have commonality of interests as far as the international politics or outcomes in the international politics are concerned. That's the second point. Thirdly, I think, in my personal opinion, I have written about it, I think the expansion of the BRICS is clearly a win for China, for the simple reason that many of the countries that are newly admitted into the BRICS have been either allies of China or are allies in a loose sense of the term, or have been very close to China, or are economically indebted to China in many ways. China has deep pockets. It has far more reach than India has. It has more money to spend on all of these countries. Therefore, I think it's going to be a group that is dominated by China, just like the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So over time, India's ability to influence outcomes within the BRICS is going to be limited. That's the third point. And finally, I would also make the argument that BRICS, the SCO, and many of the alternative organizations or institutions to the organizations or institutions in the global West, global North, like G20, G7, or the UNSC, are going to be in some ways playing into the incoming bipolar international system. So we are probably looking at a multipolar moment at this point of time, which is increasingly moving into a bipolar competition between China and the United States. If that happens, many of the alternate non-Western organizations led by China or dominated by China are going to add value to or provide, let's say, value to China's quest for being a leader of the other pole. So in many ways, therefore, you're looking at China coming out on top of it, and India in some ways, I would say, has lost out from the recent BRICS summit.
To talk of G20, we have the summit in a few days, and there has been a lot of hype building up to the G20 summit. How you say that G20 is, placed better than, let's say, BRICS, right? So is the hype leading up to G20 in our nation justified, and does the summit really has the scope to contribute significantly to its agenda of working towards sustainable development goals or green development, technological transformation, digital public infrastructure, multilateral institutions, and women-led development?
Right. I mean, G20 as an institution is not a very powerful institution. It is not a very consequential institution as far as outcomes in world politics are concerned. However, I think symbolism is important, and that's what India has focused on in during its G20 presidency. Symbolism is important because what is happening as part of the symbolism? India has made G20 as one of its core foreign policy agendas. India has also brought on board the concerns of the global south on debt restructuring, on inclusive development, on technology transfer, on the question of climate change, women-led development, etc., etc. At a time when the global west or the global north is focused more on the Ukraine war, great power competition, etc., etc., and not really focused on what is happening in the rest of the world, in the underdeveloped world, or developing world, or the global south, as it were. It takes organizations or institutions of this kind to bring forth those concerns to begin with. So when Prime Minister Modi said a few months ago at the G20 foreign ministers meeting, global governance has failed, he said, and then he went on to say that we have, meaning G20 has a responsibility towards those who are not present in this role. Meaning what? That India is playing a role of bringing the concerns of the voiceless in the international system to the high negotiating tables of great power politics. That's what India is doing in that. So I think that the symbolism is really interesting from a global south point of view and important from a global south point of view. And secondly, you're also looking at a country like India, which has always been considered as a poor, powerless country with no great consequence in the international system. Today it is saying that we are a power to reckon with. We have a role to play in the international system, and you have to accommodate a country like India to run the governance of the international system. So India is using G20 as a platform, as a vehicle to push its own agenda forward, to be part of the global governance in many ways. So I think while many of the agenda items may not necessarily lead to any significant outcomes at the end of the day, we may not even have a G20 joint communique at the end of the deliberations on the 9th of next month. However, the symbolism surrounding it, I think, is significant from a variety of perspectives that I just pointed out to you.
To pick up on this theme that global governance has failed, one look at the news cycle tells us that BRICS is in news, SCO is in news, Quad is in news. Does that mean that the aspiration for a world government through institutions like UN have taken a backseat? And what does it mean that our regional groupings better empowered to represent the interest of developing economies? Does that mean that the world is no longer divided in just one or two blocks, but the developing economies can sort of like go for forum shopping?
Right. I think that's a great question and a very complex question in some ways. Let me put it this way. At the end of the day, it is the United Nations Security Council that is of consequence when it comes to outcomes in world politics. No question about that. But it is defunct. It is defunct at this point of time, thanks to the Russia-Ukraine war, as we can see it. So at a time when the institutions that have power, that are empowered to deal with international security and other issues, the UN system in general is unable to accommodate the concerns of the rising powers and the global south as it were, because this is an institutional setup, framework that was put together at the end of the Second World War by the victors of the Second World War, and then some of the others were accommodated, like Germany and others were accommodated into it. That doesn't reflect the realities, the geopolitical realities of today or economic realities of today. That's point number one. Second point really is that can the BRICS or the SCO do better than the UNSCO? I'm not so sure about that either. That's probably not a fair comparison. But what G20, let's say G20, SCO, BRICS do is that they are continuously making this argument that there is a major section of the humanity whose voice has not been really heard in international platforms. So it is important to have more and more organizations and institutions at the global level so that these voices can be brought forward and can be listened to, and remedies for their problems can be discussed and taken. So to that extent, I would say the very fact that you have a proliferation of these institutions is in itself a good thing. I would argue that the international system or the world should not have, or we should not aspire for hegemonic perfectionism in the international system. We should aspire for democratic imperfections in the international system. To that extent, more the organizations, more the institutions, more the voices from the global south, the better. But can they overtake or can they replace the UNSC? I don't think so. But it doesn't have to be a competition. They can work together. There can be synergies. I think that's how I would see it.
Does domestic politics impact foreign policy affairs, or does it any longer?
I think theoretically speaking, I'm an academic, so I would say theoretically speaking, there are different theories about it. The liberals would say yes, definitely. The constructivists would say yes, definitely. Domestic politics influences foreign policy. The realists would say no, not really. I personally think that in democratic societies, domestic politics does have an influence on the functioning of a country's foreign policy. But in a time like this, where the international system is going through an overhaul, it's going through certain fundamental changes, it's going through a certain evolution, we don't know where that evolution is taking the world to. In a rather chaotic situation of that sort, it is the international system that influences states' behavior and not necessarily the domestic politics that is influencing state behavior. Now, the character of a regime, the character of a government comes from domestic politics. However, the behavior of that government is not necessarily always a product of domestic politics. It could easily be the product of or the function of the incentives and constraints emanating from the international system. They take the example of Iran. Now, as far as Iran is concerned, domestic politics plays a big role in its foreign policy. The manner in which the regime is construed, the manner in which the regime is constructed in Tehran, has an impact on its behavior. Whereas take a look at a country like, I would say, The United States. The United States is is a major player in the international system. Unless and until you have a Trump coming back next year and Republicans sort of withdraw from the war, the deep state or the establishment in Washington DC will be able to carry forward a foreign policy irrespective of what the Americans generally think inside of that country. In a country like Germany, for example, the domestic politics, the Green Party's agenda, etc., would influence foreign policy of Germany. In India, clearly, I mean, the BJP has managed to try to put together, fuse some of its domestic political articulations and foreign policy practices. The diaspora policy is a great example of that. But I would end by saying that domestic politics alone does not determine the foreign policy of a country. In most cases, certainly not in India's case. India is responding to the opportunities and challenges from the international system. Domestic politics can constrain it, cannot determine it.
You say that the world order is going through an overhaul. How is India placed today, and where does its best bets lie to ensure that its domestic interests are protected without necessarily giving in to the world power politics?
I think the international system definitely is going through a change. As I said, we are probably going through a multipolar moment at this point of time. We had, after the end of the Soviet Union, and the Cold War, we had the unipolar moment of the United States, led by the singular hegemon in the international system. Today, we are going through a phase of multipolarity, which will eventually lead to, we don't know when, a bipolar world led by China and the United States. As far as India is concerned, India is trying to make the best use of the multipolar moment that it is going through. It is trying to assert itself as a pole. It is trying to pose itself as a major player in the international system. At the same time, India also realizes that its bets actually lie with the United States and the West, and not with perhaps China and Russia. And there is therefore a move towards the United States and the West. The Quad is an example of that. The Malabar exercises is an example of that. The move from the continental space to the maritime space to the Indo-Pacific is an example of that. India is today closest to the United States of America than ever before in its history. That speaks for itself. So I think there is a slow movement towards accepting the realities of the bipolar world that is going to come at some point of time. But rightly so, India is now not willing to align with any of these powers, while at the same time strengthening its strategic partnerships with those countries through, as they say, multi-alignment and all of that. But I think this is also a difficult time to say exactly what should be India's foreign policy. My only advice to anyone who is making India's foreign policy is that there should be a lot more hard strategic thinking in the country about what are India's options and how do we engage those options, keeping the next 10 to 20 years in mind. And that's why, because we have fewer diplomats, they're all busy with the daily rigor of the conduct of India's foreign policy. There isn't enough time for them to actually think in a long view sense of the term. So I think this is a time to end my argument, end my answer. This is a time when India should spend a lot of time to think about the long view picture. How should India play its bets or hedge its bets in the next 10 to 20 years, and where will India be 20 years from now? I think that hard strategic thinking needs to take place now. You can't just float, you can't just go with the flow. That is not how the world's most populous country should behave.
Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your valuable opinion.
Thank you, Veena.